Greetings all, and welcome to Esoteric Babble. Today's babbling is going to be a response video. This is to a section of Aeon Byte, Talking to Spirits in Gnosticism with Scott Smith. I love Aeon Byte Radio, and I like Scott Smith. I like a lot of what he has to say. However, what he has to say regarding Buddhism, I think we could file under the heading of we can do better. We can do better than this. So I want to start off, as I might have mentioned elsewhere, and I hope it goes without saying, not everyone has to be a Buddhist. And Buddhism is not going to be attractive to everyone. I think the spiritual path we take is largely a matter of aesthetics to a certain extent. It has to intuitively feel right. And I don't think Buddhism is something that's going to feel right for everyone, just like Christianity or Islam, Sufism, Taoism, any sort of kind of spiritual or religious path. There are many, and they suit certain cultures and individuals, etc., etc. So I'm not in any way trying to advocate that we should all become Buddhists. I do think that we can take ideas from Buddhism and those ideas can help us, but that's kind of a separate matter. So in this video, it starts at around 40 minutes and 7 seconds. I'll try to sprinkle in some audio. Before he actually lists his first problem, I think he mentions that he doesn't really care for Mahayana because it arose 600 years after the Buddha, and he doesn't think it reflects what the Buddha taught. I basically regard myself as a straight-up Theravada Buddhist, but I do read Mahayana, and I sort of came to Buddhism through Zen. I think that Mahayana has a lot of valuable teachings. I think it has a huge amount of great writings, the Avatamsaka Sutra, the koans, Bodhidharma, Wangpo, Nagarjuna. I mean, there's countless kinds of great teachings found in Mahayana. And the only reason I bring up this point is because earlier I think Scott Smith does seem to have some admiration for Mormonism. And that definitely arose more than 600 years after Jesus and may not really be in conformity with what Jesus taught either. So I kind of just set that to the side. I think that we'd have to be very specific about like what Mahayana teachings are being talked about. I mean, this is kind of vague to say that doesn't reflect what the Buddha taught. We would have to say, bring up some examples. But so anyway, he mentions his first problem.
The first problem with Buddhism is that there are so many completely contradictory sects. You have to say, what the hell is Buddhism? I mean,
I think that that's one way to frame it. There are a lot of contradictory doctrines in Christianity, but we still have this umbrella term, Christianity, that we use to describe this religion. And I think that the misunderstanding, or how can I say this? I think that it seems that there are completely contradictory beliefs because we're not really looking at what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is not about formulating cosmological doctrines. And what it is about is overcoming suffering. It is a path to liberation. If you view Buddhism that way, then they might be contradictory, but the goal may be the same. And I would say, so if you talk about something like, so certain sects might say, hey, you're already enlightened. That's because so many people seem to think that enlightenment is the goal when it really isn't. We want to overcome greed and anger and delusion, and having enlightening experiences doesn't necessarily coincide with kind of the overcoming of those three sort of negative states. So I would just say in general, if some of these beliefs seem contradictory, we might sort of inquire, what is the motivation for those beliefs? What are they trying to move us towards? And I think it's always the overcoming of suffering. I mean, that's what the Buddha taught. That was his first public teaching. And I think that's what all of Buddhism strives in some way or another to help us overcome. That's what it is. And another thing, he mentions that he's been to these many monasteries throughout India, and I think that's awesome. But he doesn't actually cite, at least by name, any of the monks or nuns that he talked to there. And he kind of mentions, like at 4207, this thing about they.
Because one of my criticisms about Buddhism, as it's popularly discussed, is that they love to sound hip by making a really radical statement like, oh, there is no self.
There's kind of this vague notion, this vague pronoun thrown around, they. Who is they? Who are the people who are saying these things? That would help us to know, or, to kind of assess how serious we should take these claims. If you ask someone who is maybe brought up as a Christian, but who's never reflected on Christianity before, if you might ask that person some questions about Christianity, you may not get very satisfactory answers. Or I don't think we would want to take that as a shining example of all Christians. We might have to talk to some other people too. So certainly Buddhism is going to have people who are new to it or who do maybe think that it's hip. But again, this is more of something that I feel that Scott Smith, he's reacting sort of like, sort of a guttural response he has to certain people. And I don't doubt that there are people out there who are Buddhists and don't have a good way of formulating all of these doctrines. And I certainly would not claim that I can do that. But again, I think that if we think of what the overall project of Buddhism is, to overcome suffering, and think along those lines, then some of these other problems might go away. Now, I do have a lot of sympathy for Scott when he talks about no self, because I think no self is a very bad way to formulate it's not great to have doctrines in Buddhism. And I think that no self is something that's become a doctrine. And so I certainly in agreement with, people who talk vaguely about no self. That's not good. But if we think about what the Buddha has to say about that, anatta in Pali, is that if we go to like the daily Pali reading has a little series on the anicca suttang. And the Buddha starts off by saying, rupang aniccang, the body is impermanent. That which is impermanent is dukkha, is maybe suffering or ill at ease, or it's the wobbly wheel. And that which is dukkha is not the self. Doesn't say that there is no self. He mentions that our body is not the self. And, Scott mentions, he says that, we can look back and see that, the root of our body is, I guess, the same, or I don't know what the root of our body is. And that's the point, that if I am my body, am I me now? Was I, my body when I was 12 years old, when I was 33 years old, when I was 33 minutes old? Which body is the me? Is it all of them put together? Is it the body right before I die? And the same applies to any mental constituents. Again, Scott mentions the fact that we have memories of our childhood.
But we have memories from childhood. It's not like, we can't remember what happened because we're a different person.
But have you ever had a situation where you've talked to someone and you realize that your memory was wrong, or at least someone else had a different memory than you? So I don't know that our memories are a good guide to saying that, yeah, I remember who I was. I mean, yeah, we have memories. I have memories of dreams I had, but I don't sort of think about dreams as having the same level of reality that I think of that I'm experiencing right now. So again, I think this is all, it is a problem when people start to say that there's no self. I think that, and this is part of a longer discussion, I think that there is a, quote, self. There is an atta, but that atta is nibbana. It's nirvana. That is what we're aiming for. And I think what the Buddha is saying is that, and not only the Buddha, many spiritual teachers, the more we identify with our body, the more we will suffer. The more we identify with any sort of narrative of us, the more we will, quote, suffer. That we have to transcend that and try to find this transcendent state, or, again, there aren't words that can actually express whatever nirvana is. And also, though, I do want to say, I've heard people talk about, it seems like they laugh. I think Miguel kind of laughed when he mentions that we don't have a self. But is not having a self so hard to believe? I mean, we watch videos all the time and think that there are these people moving around on the screen, and they're not. Video is just a succession of 24 still images per second, or 30 or 60 or however many. And we know that the picture we're seeing is an illusion. And when we think about ourself, that's what the Buddha is saying, that it's very illusory in that sense. It's not the sort of thing that we think it is. And I think Plato and Aristotle would agree that anything that is not permanent, we can't call real to a certain extent. Now, again, that can also be kind of vague, but that is where the Buddha is coming from, and it's a very practical point. It's trying to move us to a place where we don't attach to the wrong sort of thing in the world we're in samsara. We're trying to move ultimately beyond that. So again, Scott mentions that, he says, well, a lot of findings would say that we have a spirit. Yeah, we have a spirit. It's just that spirit changes. And it could be our subtle body. Our subtle body can transmigrate, but it is still subject to samsara no matter where we end up. So even identifying with that spirit would be incorrect. That's something where I think that near-death experiencers, and I know that they have a sense of what they've experienced as being even more real than this, this sort of consensus reality. But that doesn't mean that that's the ultimate end. So I'll kind of leave that there. Now, there is one thing at 4315. He mentions that this scholar, Ken Wilber.
Ken Wilber will say that, kind of contrary to popular Mahayana practices, there is no self, according to the Buddha. The only thing that reincarnates is a magnetized set of karma. There's no memories. There's no personality. And anybody who thinks so really doesn't understand the Buddha.
I would say if that's what Ken Wilber states, then he does not understand the Buddha. The Buddha talks about the three knowledges, the tavidya. And one of those is that a person at that level gains memories of all their past lives, not one past life, not two, not 10, not 100, not 10,000, all of them, countless past lives. That is what the Buddha says. This is not once or twice. I mean, you can just search out the three knowledges of Buddhism. This is one of the knowledges. So the point is that in Buddhism, it's not about just this kind of mechanical karma that is reborn. And again, Daily Pali Reading has a little bit of that from the Milinda Panho about the Patisandahiti. It's the Namarupang that is relinked, or that is reborn. And it is true, it's not this actual mind-body complex. And I think that makes sense. I mean, if I were to die and say arise and be born in Afghanistan as a female, if I came into a female body and just a heterosexual female, how much of Charles, how much of me is actually left there? So, and it seems like there are children who have memories of past lives. So I don't think that, the Buddha has ever stated that can't happen. And as a matter of fact, in the Majjhima Nikaya, he has a very interesting, I'll try to put the number up. He talks about how, about being rebirthed in these different levels, how a monk might see a rich family and think, oh, in my next life, that's what I want to attain. And he can set about and attain that. Some monk might want to be born in the highest Brahma world, and he can do that. But the Buddha also mentions that, that's not the goal, that there is a monk who wants complete liberation, and he says that monk is not reborn anywhere. So again, I think if we keep in mind what the aim of Buddhism is, it can help us better understand these different forms of Buddhism. And again, no one has to be a Buddhist. This might all seem like it's completely ridiculous, or it just might not seem like it's for you. There are many other spiritual paths. There are many ways up the mountain. But to say that Buddhism, because of some of these, or let's put it this way, what Scott Smith mentions here, I don't think are in any way problems at all. I think you just have to think through a little more, and these are easily resolvable issues. So, dear listener, I would really value what you have to say on this. I really welcome when people don't agree with me, but any comment you have, please leave below. And a heartfelt wish for the end of suffering for all beings. Peace.